Let's try today. Does it improve this laptop's performance if we increase the RAM memory? So this is the Lenovo IdeaPad Gaming, and here are the other specs. So let's open this software and see what's the memory size of the RAM right now. So in slot 1 we got DDR4, 8 gigs. And in the other slot we got DDR4 also and 8 gigs. So total of 16 gigs of RAM. So let's try to add 16 gigs to those two slots, so we get total of 32 gigs of RAM compared to this 16 gigs of RAM. I got this Kingston DDR4 16 gigs RAM. And what I read that this computer should be able to handle 32 gigs of RAM memory. But let's first run a couple of these benchmark test with this 16 gigs of RAM. And after we have installed the 32 gigs of RAM, let's do this test again so we can compare the results. So was it really worth to do the upgrade? So let's run the benchmark test. Let's also compare the rendering speed. I've got this in DaVinci Resolve open here, and here is some footage I have taken with the DJI Mini Pro 2 drone, which is in 4K. So I will render this video and take time. So it took 10 minutes and 23 seconds to render this 5-minute long 4K video with the DaVinci Resolve. Now when we have done this test, let's replace that 16 gigs of RAM with this 32 gigs of RAM. First we're gonna shut down the computer and open the back cover and install those RAM memories. The tools to put the new RAM inside the computer are, I'm gonna use a guitar pick to open the cover and a screwdriver set. So we're gonna first open all these screws from the back cover. Let's start unscrewing those screws. These 4 screws that were located in these spots were a little bit shorter in size than these ones that were located up here. First we're gonna unplug the battery cables. Once we have removed the battery cable, there's no possibility of short circuit. And next we are gonna open this and the RAM memory is located under this plate. here we can see those 2 slots where the RAM memory goes. And we push these clips to the side so the memory pops out. And let's put these 16 gigs RAM cards to their places, so we get total of 32 gigs of RAM. And let's push the card a little bit down, and we hear the clicking sound. And we do the same with the other RAM card. Then we put the battery cable back on to its place. Now we cover those RAM memory cards with the heatsink pad. Then let's put the back cover back on and all those screws. And as we noticed, these top screws were just slightly longer than those one that went in this corner. And now when we have installed the new RAM memory, it's time to flip the computer and turn it on. And we check how does the memory setting say about the memory right now. So in slot 1 we got 16 gigs, and slot 2 16 gig. So total 32 gigs of RAM compared to the old 16 gigs of RAM. Let's plug the power source and do the benchmark test. Let's run the benchmark test with this 32 gigs of RAM setup. So now we have done test both with 16 gigs of RAM and 32 gigs of RAM. So let's first take a look at this 16 gigs of RAM results. So it scored 5,247 points. And let's compare that to this 32 gigs of RAM benchmark result. 5,201 points. So it's basically the same with the 16 gigs of RAM compared to the 32 gigs of RAM. And this is the rendering speed test with this 32 gigs of RAM setup. Let's go through final results. So in benchmark test, the 16 gigs of RAM scored 5,247 points and the 32 gigs of RAM scored 5,201 points. So basically the same result. When it came rendering the 4K video, which was about 5 minutes long, the 16 gigs of RAM did it in time of 10 minutes 23 seconds, and the 32 gigs of RAM setup did it in time of 10 minutes and 8 seconds. So the 32 gigs of RAM setup did it in about 15 seconds faster. This was my experiment from switching from using 16 gigs of RAM to 32 gigs of RAM. So there was not so much difference. There might be some hardware issues with this laptop, that this hardware just can't handle 32 gigs to its full potential. But when it came to rendering video, the 32 gigs of RAM setup did it a little bit faster. And when I was using DaVinci Resolve, there was not so much lagging and everything went a little bit more smoother. Thanks for watching and bye. Little update after using this 32 gigs of RAM for a while, especially with the DaVinci Resolve video editor. Everything just works a little bit more smoother. So it was worth to switch from using 16 gigs of RAM to this 32 gigs of RAM, especially when using video editor like this. Reason why the DaVinci Resolve runs now a little bit smoother than with the 16 gigs of RAM might be that DaVinci Resolve uses quite much RAM memory.